Sorry for the screen layout here, but this is just how Sonic Rush works. You use both screens in tandem with each other, where they're one on top of the other. There's really no way to get an accurate look at what this game is supposed to be like other than to just show you both screens. Cutting back and forth from one to the other doesn't really accurately represent what this game plays like, as you are supposed to be using the two screens in tandem. So this is just what it's going to look like. Anyway, Sonic Rush. This is a very important Sonic game, obviously, as it kind of set us on the path that we are currently on to this very day with the Sonic series. Now, getting into it with the core gameplay, at the base level, we're pretty much picking up right where Sonic Advance 2 left us. The team mechanics from Sonic Advance 3 are gone in this game, which I don't necessarily have much of a problem with, because they were pretty ridiculous. But Sonic Rush also introduces its own new ridiculous mechanic into the game with the boost. This is pretty much the only new thing that Sonic Rush adds to the core gameplay, but the boost is the most important and impactful mechanic that has been added to a Sonic game ever. More important than the spin dash, more important than even rolling in a ball in Sonic 1. No mechanic in Sonic has ever affected how the gameplay of the series works as much, not even close. The way the boost works is pretty simple. You got a meter there on the left side of the screen that governs how much you can boost, and you hold down the boost button and it will set your speed to the absolute maximum, launching you forward, and it will also make you invincible and attack enemies while you're boosting. And that's pretty much all there is to it, which sounds very simple just explaining it, but what's so critical about the boost is how it impacts the design and the gameplay of Sonic. Because the 2D Sonic games, it's always been about those momentum mechanics, the physics, the high amount of variability between your movement speeds, the fact that the terrain will influence how you move and what you can do. That was literally the foundation that started everything that would turn into Sonic the Hedgehog. And for the most part, those elements are still here and still present in Sonic Rush. However, they don't even really matter that much because of the existence of the boost. For example, slopes impacting your movement speed, slowing down when you're going uphill and speeding up when you're going downhill, and how rolling influences that. That is essentially irrelevant here in Sonic Rush because the boost overrides all of those things. It doesn't matter what terrain you're on, if you're boosting in Sonic Rush, you are moving at top speed all the time. And there are other things like this as well as products of how the boost works. Like, the spin dash is still in this game, but it's something you very rarely use because you don't need it. If you ever need a sudden burst of speed, then you just hit that boost button and bada boom bada bing, you have all the speed you could ever need. Having to worry about the fact that you're vulnerable to enemies when you're not rolling, that goes away as well. Enemies basically become non-obstacles as long as you're boosting. And of course you have things like really tall slopes that you might not have enough speed to make it up. Well, in Sonic Rush, you will always have enough speed so long as you boost. I mean, Sonic Rush even also still has the boost mode introduced in Sonic Advance 2, where you get the after images and it increases your top speed, but that too is essentially irrelevant now because the boost overrides it. You can trigger the boost mode anytime whenever you want by just boosting. So yeah, just this one little mechanic introduced in this game is so massively, overwhelmingly powerful that it irrelevantizes so many of the other mechanics that have been fundamental to what Sonic gameplay is. Which might cause you to assume that I don't like Sonic Rush because of how much it takes away from Sonic gameplay, but actually that is not the case. I still really enjoy Sonic Rush a lot. I think it's really, really fun. Because here's the thing, yes, the boost does take away a lot of stuff from Sonic and simplify the gameplay quite a bit. But this was not an accident. This was not something that they did not know would be the case when they implemented it. It has been suggested many times by many people that Sonic Team uses the boost nowadays as a substitute for the fact that they are incapable of making momentum physics. but the game where the boost originates from was made by a team that has already demonstrated that they know how to do momentum physics because they made the Sonic Advance games, which did have pretty good Sonic physics. And yeah, Sonic Rush's physics aren't nearly as good as the Advance games. There are some weird things about how it works, but I don't think the boost is meant to be a band-aid to cover over that problem. I think that is just a product of the fact that they knew that the physics would be less important for this game, so they didn't bother to spend a lot of time getting them right because they wouldn't really impact the gameplay that much anyway. So the implementation of the boost and simplifying Sonic gameplay so much was a deliberate choice that the developers of this game made, and I don't necessarily think it was a bad decision. While I definitely do prefer the more complex gameplay granted from the momentum focus of previous 2D Sonic games, what Sonic Rush does is it makes Sonic gameplay more approachable, which is something that I don't necessarily think is bad. To this day, there are still so many people that don't even really fully understand what Sonic games even are. I mean, I've gone on and on throughout this series about how much I love time-attacking Sonic games and how much that is a big focus in their design, yet the vast majority of Sonic players have never even attempted to time-attack Sonic games before. So considering that the vast majority of your player base doesn't even know how to play your games correctly, I think it's a pretty sensible decision to come to think, hey, maybe this is a little bit too complex. What if we tried simplifying things and hoped that it would become more obvious and apparent to players what you're supposed to do? And you know what? To their credit, it absolutely worked, because I have seen many instances where people do start to get into the time attack experience of Sonic with boost games, including myself. It wasn't Sonic Rush that got me into it was Sonic Unleashed that really got me to understand and see what Sonic games are all about, and I think the simplicity of boost gameplay is what helped me realize that. And as someone that has now gotten into time attack with all the Sonic games, including the much more complex ones like Sonic Advance 3, even now when I come back to Sonic Rush and do time attack this game, I still find it to be incredibly fun, because when you're really in there and playing Sonic Rush, it isn't really that different from the more complex Momentum 2D Sonic games. Obviously, a lot of the gameplay elements are no longer there. Having to consider your speed, knowing when to stop and do a spin dash and when to just keep going, how to use the terrain correctly to speed yourself up, a lot of that stuff does go away. But what still remains is the Sonic level design structure is absolutely here in full force, and I think the level design of Sonic Rush is really good. You still have that period of experimenting with the level design and trying to figure out what the fastest route is, generally trying to stay at the top of the level, but also at the same time there's all the platforming sequences that you have to figure out what is the fastest way to get through these obstacles. Yeah, a lot of the times the answer is just to boost, but for a lot of the platforming in this game, that can be kinda risky and mess you up, so you have the choice of, do you want to take it the slower, easier way, or do you want to do it the more faster and difficult way by trying to rush your way through the platforming? It's often said that the classic Sonic games do not just give you speed, you have to earn it by playing well. I've said that too, because it's true. Whereas Sonic Rush, they do just give you the speed, but the thing is, they give it to you and they ask you, can you handle it? They want you to take that speed and use it to its fullest, but using it is gonna make things a lot more difficult for you, and if you're not good enough, you're probably better off not using it. So it kind of works in the inverse way. You do have the speed for free, but to actually use it well in such a way where it's not going to screw you up, you need to be good enough at the game to earn that. And by doing that and experimenting, you figure out ways to take shortcuts and skip over things and lots of stuff like that. All of those elements are still there, and then once you have your route figured out, then it's that same thing of practice, of running the level repeatedly and getting better and better at it, improving your times and shaving off those seconds. When you're really doing it, Sonic Rush doesn't really feel that different than other Sonic games, and it really isn't any less fun, despite the fact that it is much simpler. In a way, it kind of just streamlines Sonic gameplay and gets you to the most enjoyable parts of it, at least in my opinion, much faster. Due to the nature that this game is so much simpler, it also becomes a lot easier than other Sonic games because you don't have to precisely manage your speed and make sure that you have enough to clear this slope and make this big slope jump that'll take this big shortcut. The boost takes care of all that for you, so the gameplay does get a lot easier here. But honestly, in a way, that does kind of get a little bit relieving for me, because after time attacking so many difficult, complex Sonic games, it's nice to have a Sonic game where I don't have to run a level a billion times to get a really good run on it. Sonic Rush levels don't really take me that many attempts to get good times on them because of how simple and easy they are, which, you know, it just kind of results in a bit more of a laid-back Sonic experience, which I can get behind from time to time. And while Sonic Rush does simplify a lot of things, it also does add some new layers to Sonic as well that have not been there previously. The boost meter actually does have some pretty cool mechanics in this game, because it works the way that you would expect. If you're boosting, then you're going to be depleting the meter, and naturally, if you don't have any boost meter, then you can't boost. And the boost meter actually does drain pretty quickly in this game, and so if you just try to boost constantly, you're actually going to end up running out, and then you won't be able to boost anymore, which is going to slow you down and then force you to have to rely on momentum mechanics again. So in this game, momentum stuff is still there, and it's still part of the gameplay, but it now acts as your punishment for running out of meter, for playing poorly. The way that you actually get the most out of the boost in this game is to not use it until the meter fills up. Because once the meter fills all the way, then you get a limited amount of time of having infinite boost meter. And what's cool about this is that there are ways to extend how long this infinite boost lasts for, primarily by doing tricks either in the air or while grinding on rails, or by killing enemies. This actually adds a lot of cool stuff to the gameplay where you can see how much time you have left on your infinite boost by the little star icon at the top of the meter. How fast it's spinning tells you how much time you have left on infinite boost. As it starts to slow down, you know you're running out of time, and when it comes to a stop, you go back to normal meter. But the fact that you can only fill boost by doing tricks or killing enemies means that you can't maintain this infinite boost whenever you want. You have to use the level design in order to do it. This means you have extra things to consider if you want to keep your boost topped up at all times, which naturally you do if you want to play quickly. You have to try to take advantage of every single spring and every single rail and every single ramp, tricking as much as you can to keep your infinite meter going. Or sometimes you have to go out of your way to kill an enemy to refresh your boost meter, because sometimes there are instances in the level design where there's just no opportunities to maintain your infinite boost because there's no springs or no enemies for a while. But then once one finally does show up, you have to make sure that you get it and not mess it up. There are a lot of instances where a spring will launch you a very short distance in between two platforms, and you have a very tiny window to time a trick in between there to keep your meter going. Or in other instances, you might have to go out of your way to absolutely make certain you kill that enemy, because if you accidentally run past them, then you're going to run out of infinite boost, and that's going to slow you down. Similarly, in typical Sonic level design where the top path is faster than the lower paths, I find generally that the level design, there are more plentiful opportunities to maintain your boost meter on the higher paths, whereas on the lower ones have much larger gaps in between opportunities to keep your boost going. Actually, now that I think about it, this actually kind of fixes the issue with like set piece type stuff in Sonic games where you actually don't do anything for a while. Because now these things actually do serve a purpose to the gameplay. They're stalling, they're making it so you can't do anything to maintain your infinite meter. It's wasting time, and so when you finally get out of there, you're going to have way less time to do something to maintain your infinite boost. Look at that, Sonic Rush fixing problems that have been fundamental to the Sonic series for years. You'll love to see it. So along with the level design itself also taking longer at the bottom path, you also have to go through it slower, as you won't be able to maintain your boost as well. Another thing worth noting is that when you take a hit in this game, then you lose a big chunk of your boost meter and are automatically kicked out of infinite boost if that's currently active. And with the way that the game is designed, there are a lot of enemies that are in your direct line of path when you're going too fast that you probably won't be able to react to them. This is nothing particularly new for Sonic, but oftentimes in Sonic games, this is seen as cheap traps that you could have never seen coming. But now in Sonic Rush, you have a pre-canned built-in way to avoid these traps without even knowing they're there, simply by boosting. This encourages the player to boost as much as possible and thus punishes the player for not boosting. Thus you get punished for going slow, and you get punished for not being able to properly maintain your meter. And because maintaining infinite boost is so important, there are actually plenty of instances in Sonic Rush where you don't actually want to be boosting, because if you don't have a full meter, then you're going to be preventing yourself from getting to infinite meter. The less meter you have, then the longer it's going to take to build meter to get to that infinite boost. And so I find that if I don't have infinite boost, then I only ever use the boost in short bursts just to give me that nice burst of speed, and then I do the rest of it manually. And this now makes it so that a lot of those boost-intended hazards become things that you have to look out for and worry about. And this isn't something that you can avoid, because sometimes the level design just straight up does not allow you to maintain infinite boost, and it's going to just force you to lose it. So there is some variability in terms of how you play Sonic Rush. It's not just constant boosting all day, every day. It's still like 90% of the gameplay, but there is still an amount there where you don't rely on the boost, which I think is good. There is also, of course, instances where even if you don't have infinite boost, it's still worth it to use. For example, if you're at the end of the level, then it doesn't matter if you're about to run out, so go ahead and spend it all. Or if you know there's a sequence coming up with a ton of enemies that you can plow through to get tons of boost meter, then maybe you can afford to use it even if you don't have infinite boost. This kind of ends up in function maintaining some of those terrain-based momentum mechanics in Sonic, because you have to take advantage of the level design to speed yourself up and maintain your speed properly. It's done in a different way that is definitely simpler than what's in the other 2D games, but it's still there in a form that I think is pretty cool and fun, and definitely gives you things to think about when you're trying to play Sonic Rush fast. It's all still there, it's just executed in a different way. So yeah, while Sonic Rush has simplified Sonic gameplay and kind of taken away a lot of the fundamental things that Sonic has always been about, it has done so in a way where it still maintains a lot of what's fun about Sonic gameplay, and it's added other things that do still add some depth to this gameplay. Like I said before, this doesn't really feel that different from other Sonic games in terms of its core design and philosophy. It's just, instead of relying on the physics, it's more relying on the systems of the boost meter and how that impacts the gameplay. This results in a streamlined Sonic game that is much more approachable, much easier for players to understand and get into, much easier for players to just play in general, while still maintaining a lot of what makes Sonic so much fun to me. So much so that I still put Sonic Rush right up there with a lot of my favorite Sonic games. I think this game is super fucking fun. There are, of course, some problems, like, for example, while I do think the level design of Sonic Rush in general is really, really good, there are some things about it that I don't really like. For one, there are a number of auto-scrollers in this game, and I just really don't like auto-scrollers in general in any game, really. But particularly for Sonic, auto-scrollers don't make any sense, as, you know, there's no way to speed up an auto-scroller. They move at the speed they move at, which doesn't really mesh with Sonic gameplay. There's not too many of them, but sometimes when you're playing certain levels, you just always have to get to the boring part, and when you have to run the level over and over to try to time attack it, that kinda just sucks. The other thing that I don't like about Sonic Rush level design is there are a couple of instances in the game where they lock you in a room with a bunch of enemies and you have to kill them all to get out. Which, you know, there are still ways where this can feel pretty Sonic-y because you have to route out a good way to efficiently kill the enemies as quickly as possible. In the early ones, that kind of just constitutes boosting back and forth until all the enemies are dead, but in the later ones, they add some more complex level design to these little battle arenas that actually do force you to try to figure out how to do them well. So they're not as bad as the auto-scrollers, but still, in general, I just find that these are kind of not that much fun for the most part. Not a major problem or anything, but not my favorite thing in the world. Another thing that's worth mentioning, of course, is the two playable characters in the game, Sonic and Blaze, and this is something that is definitely worth talking about because in many ways I see Sonic Rush as what Sonic Advance 2 was trying to be. Sonic Advance 2 was a Sonic game that significantly reduced the emphasis on platforming and really emphasized the speed. Naturally, Sonic Rush also does that, but it does so in a way that I think is far more successful than Sonic Advance 2. The flow of the game is better, the level design I think is much more natural and understandable, and actually while Rush does have quite an emphasis on the speed stuff, there is still quite a good amount of platforming in this game, unlike Advance 2. And actually, the speed, despite being Sonic Rush being, a speed, boost, go forward all the time kind of game, it's actually fairly slow for Sonic standards. I mean, just think about like Chemical Plant or Hydro City in the classic Sonic games. When the terrain would allow you to, you go way faster in those games than you ever do in Rush. This to me speaks of the team realizing the mistake they made with Advance 2 by making it way too fast. This game, still while very speed-focused, is at a much better pace that makes it much more playable. And additionally, another problem that Sonic Advance 2 had was the design of its speed-based gameplay was such that the different character abilities were essentially irrelevant in that game because they would break your flow. Tails flying and Knuckles gliding and all that stuff, it would slow you down so much that there was never really an instance where using those things was actually a worthwhile thing to do. Sonic Rush realizes this problem, and it doesn't necessarily fix it, but it tries to make a second playable character that works within the limitations of this type of speed-all-the-time gameplay. Because Blaze isn't really that different from how Sonic plays. She generally works almost exactly the same as how Sonic does. She has the boost and a lot of the same mechanics and abilities and everything, because that's just the nature of this type of gameplay. The boost is such an overwhelmingly powerful mechanic that it is going to override pretty much anything else you can do. So you're pretty limited in what you can do to make different playable characters that actually play differently from each other. But they did what they could with Blaze in Sonic Rush, because there are some differences between her and Sonic. For one, Blaze is slower than Sonic is when running on the ground, but as a trade-off, she has better maneuverability in the air. And while Sonic has his air dash and homing attack, Blaze instead has this hover move that allows her to extend the length of her jumps. And her air tricks launch her much higher and much further than Sonic's do. And that's pretty much everything that makes Blaze different than Sonic, which isn't a lot, and generally they do play very similarly, but these minor differences between the characters absolutely do end up making a difference in how you play them if you're really trying to optimize and play as quickly as possible. Because of Blaze's enhanced air abilities, there are a lot of shortcuts available to her that Sonic simply does not have access to. In fact, there are some routes in this game that are completely inaccessible to Sonic, and only Blaze can take them. Blaze can also make a lot of small optimizations that Sonic simply can't, where you can cut a corner simply due to her enhanced air abilities. But this kind of works as a trade-off, because while Sonic can't take as many shortcuts, him having a higher top speed kind of acts to compensate for that a little bit. So, while Sonic and Blaze aren't super different from each other, they are different enough that playing as the two of them does impact the gameplay in ways that actually changes things up depending on who you're playing as opposed to something like Sonic Advance 2, where it basically does not matter who you play as, you play the game almost exactly the same. Of course, this doesn't compare to the amount of difference and variety you get from something like Sonic Advance 3, or even Sonic 3 and Knuckles for that matter, but it's something, and with this type of gameplay and the way it's designed, I really think this is just about as good as you could hope for. At least if you're going to give every character the boost, which obviously they did, because, Sonic Rush, that's the new thing, is the boost. They want it to be the big prominent part of the game. But I suppose you could have characters that don't have the boost, and then you could have some more traditional Sonic gameplay as well. That could potentially work. I actually should try that, trying to play one of these games without boosting and see how that works. I imagine just because the way that the level design is laid out, it wouldn't really change that much. It seems like it would probably just be the same game, but you just do less things and there's less going on because you're no longer worrying about all the meter management stuff. But it's worth giving a shot, I suppose. So all in all, I think that the core gameplay of Sonic Rush is pretty fantastic. And while it's not my favorite way to push the Sonic series forward, you know, I would rather we continue to add more depth to the gameplay rather than taking some away and making things simpler. When you decide to, alright, we're gonna make things simpler and streamline the gameplay, within the context of that decision, I think they did a fantastic job, and they did so in such a way where they didn't really make the gameplay any less fun despite being much simpler. Depending on what game we're comparing it to, like, I do still think that Advance 3 is definitely the best, but as far as your typical 2D Sonic games go, I would say Sonic Rush is right in line with the best of them. Of course, if you are dead set on Sonic needs those momentum mechanics, I can understand Sonic Rush not really doing it for you, but as I said in my Sonic Advance 3 video, I don't necessarily need momentum mechanics in Sonic. I care primarily about fun gameplay and fun movement mechanics, and I think Sonic Rush does have that. And even though it is lacking that momentum stuff, it has pretty much every other element that makes a Sonic game. It does so in a different way, you could say it's a different type of Sonic game, but still definitely a Sonic game. One thing about Sonic Rush, though, that I do think kind of misses the mark in terms of it being a proper Sonic game, though, is a little bit of the level design in one particular way. In terms of the level layout stuff, I think that the level design is great. I got no problems there, and Sonic Rush follows your typical Sonic structure of zones with 2 acts and then a boss. And of course, every zone has its own level gimmicks that changes up the gameplay a little bit. All that is perfectly fine, but there is one thing that's missing here. It is the way the level design is kind of, I don't know, flavored, I would say? It's kind of hard to describe. The level design itself, as I said, is fine, but I'm talking about, like, the way the actual terrain of the levels is built. The way that the landscape is formed, the shapes, the geometry of the actual levels themselves. One thing that it's missing is that Sonic zones, they're not just a different background with different gimmicks. They also all have their own kind of terrain structure that makes them feel different from each other thematically, that makes them feel like different places. Think about, like, Sonic 3 and Knuckles. Think about Hydro City. What are, like, the notable things about Hydro City's layout and terrain style? There is a lot of flat ground and straight walls. It doesn't have a lot of curves and bends in its terrain in the way something like Green Hill does. Green Hill doesn't really have a lot of flat ground. All of the terrain there is kind of sloping up and down in small ways, whereas Hydro City is generally more flat and blocky with long tubes everywhere. That is to make it feel like a confined place underground, and then all the long tubes are there to imply the feeling of like an aqueduct with all these ways for the water to travel around this location. Then you compare that to something like Lava Reef, and Lava Reef has a lot of uneven terrain, and the entire level design, there's a lot of confined, tight spaces to make you feel like you're going through a bunch of caves. Then you go to like Sonic Advance 3 and you look at Route 99, and there is a lot of really long, straight pieces of land that kind of feels like you're running along a highway. But then you get to like Aquatic Base in that game, and again, it's very tight and confined, and the entire level design is extremely vertical. That zone has its own unique personality that doesn't necessarily have to do with the zone gimmicks. There's no reason Aquatic Base has to be a very vertical zone, but it's just part of the zone's character. That is the kind of thing I'm talking about that Sonic Rush doesn't really have. Pretty much every previous Sonic game, even a lot of the 3D ones, have this element of the level design present. But Sonic Rush, if you were to gray box out these levels and have no theming whatsoever and you took away all the level gimmicks, I probably wouldn't be able to tell one zone from the other just based on the terrain, whereas I bet you I could if you showed me Sonic 2 levels with all of the details removed. Not really a huge problem, but I do think it is something worth noting. It's something that I think pretty much every Boost Sonic game is kind of missing. One thing I will say that I don't like about this game is controlling yourself in the air, how it no longer really has proper momentum to it. If you're flying through the air with a bunch of speed, if you let go of your movement, then you'll just immediately come to a stop, which is very weird for Sonic. And it messed me up quite a bit during a lot of the platforming of the game where I would try to pull back to slow myself down, but that's entirely unnecessary, and in fact I'm making myself go in the opposite direction. That's one area where I don't think they should have skimped on the physics, but it's not too hard to get used to. I know there I kinda combined the talking about the core gameplay and the time attack together, but that's because Sonic Rush's gameplay is in such a way that I find time attacking to be intrinsically linked to just playing Sonic Rush. They really are one and the same in the case of this game, and that's even reflected in the game's ranking system, because while this game does have score, its scoring system works very differently than other Sonic games. First of all, you don't actually accumulate any points while you're playing through the level. You only get all your points at the end once you complete it. And the things they rate you on kind of all culminate together to basically just make it so that playing for S ranks and time attacking are essentially the same thing. Because in this game, the time bonus is like 90% of what your score is made up of. And then, yeah, you do still also have the banana bonus, but then you also have the speed bonus, which just gives you points based on how quickly you were moving through the level, and the trick bonus, which is dependent on how many tricks you did through the level. And, you know, moving fast is pretty conducive to getting a good time, and doing tricks fills your boost meter, which lets you go faster, which is also conducive to getting a good time. So really the majority of the scoring system is just an overly complicated way to just have time attacking the game being what the scoring system is really rating. Which is totally fine by me, because like Sonic Advance 3, it means that Sonic Rush is a very focused game that is pretty much entirely built around time attack. And you can definitely feel that reflected in the level design. And the S ranks are actually kinda tough to get in this game. Not like super duper hard, but they're definitely not free, as they can be in many Sonic games. Now let's get into all of the extra typical Sonic things. So first let's touch on the bosses. And no, this time I'm not just going to be saying the bosses are not good like always and we're going to move on, because there is actually something to say here. Because a lot of the Sonic bosses in the previous 2D games have been barely even anything worth noting. They're these very, very small, very brief fights that last a couple of seconds with very little gameplay going on, and then it's essentially over. They generally don't really have very much going on in the first place. However, credit where it's due, Sonic Rush, they put a lot more work into the bosses in this game than pretty much any other 2D Sonic game. Now the bosses are much more significant affairs. The fights go on for way longer, and they're way more complex enemies than what you typically see for 2D Sonic. They are a lot more involved and take a lot more thought. You can't just jump on the enemy repeatedly until they die. And they've actually added a really cool and interesting new mechanic that I really like, that I'm pretty sure is only present when you're fighting the bosses, that has to do with the issue of Sonic where, you know, because of the banana system, you can basically be unkillable when fighting enemies as long as you have one banana. That is actually addressed in Sonic Rush in a pretty cool way. In this game, when you're fighting bosses, they've added a system where as you take more and more attacks, your bananas will actually explode out of you much more aggressively and with much more speed. This means that eventually, if you keep taking hits, your bananas will eventually fly out of you so hard that it is impossible to recollect them. And leading up to that point, as you continue to take hits, they'll get launched further and further away, making it more difficult for you to recollect them, so that actually makes it so you can't just basically irrelevantize the bosses by just using invincibility frames. Because of how long these bosses can go on for, you really do want to avoid taking hits here, so that is a great improvement. They have really put in a lot to actually make the bosses here a lot better than most Sonic games. Which is then unfortunate because I find these bosses to actually be some of the worst in the entire Sonic series. You know, like Chaos 4 and Iblis 2, and how everyone complains about how boring those fights are because you just sit there doing nothing for the vast majority of the fight? That is almost every single boss in Sonic Rush. You just sit there and do nothing constantly as you wait for the bosses to attack. They have such elaborate animations and they spend so much time in between their attacks that 90% of the boss fight is made up of them getting ready to attack you and not actually attacking you. These bosses are so fucking boring. Almost every single one is a major slog, to the point where these alone were massively hurting the experience I had playing through Sonic Rush. Because, like, this is exactly what I've been saying this entire time with the bosses in Sonic. It's just made a much larger problem here. You look at the gameplay when you're going through the levels and oh my god, it's so fun, it's so cool, so fast-paced, you're constantly doing all these cool things to speed up and the gameplay is so awesome. And then after doing the 2 acts, you go into this fucking boring-ass fight where you spend the majority of it sitting here doing nothing. It's just wait, dodge and attack. Wait, dodge and attack. Wait, and so on and so forth. It almost makes me think that they can't have playtested these bosses, because how could anyone say that these are okay? It's so shitty playing through Sonic Rush, where you get this massive whiplash between insanely fun gameplay and then the most boring fucking thing in the universe. And the fact that the bosses are so much more elaborate now and take so much longer to fight turns into a massive downgrade, because you just sit here doing nothing for like 4 minutes in some cases. And oh my god, getting all the S ranks in this game, fucking Christ. Super duper fun when playing the levels, it's basically just time attacking, but then when you start doing it on the bosses, it is just a slog. It sucks so hard, because you fight the boss and you make a mistake here or there and you're a little short on the time and you gotta do the whole fight over again, and then you make a mistake again, you gotta do the whole fight over again and again. You know, the typical thing, you mess up, you gotta try again. But when the boss is 5 minutes of doing nothing, that is agonizingly boring, and it sucked so hard. I was almost not going to do it, but I powered through it. Even the fact that you have to play the game twice, both as Sonic and Blaze, and you fight all of the bosses as both of them, and they are exactly the same. So I had to get the S rank with both characters on every boss. Oh my god, it was fucking awful. And like I said, it's very unfortunate, because all you'd have to do, really, is decrease the amount of time in between the boss attacks, instead of having them stand there doing nothing between their attacks and taking so long to start their attacks. If they were just throwing these attacks at you one after the other, basically constantly, I think these could probably be some of the best bosses in the entire series. So yeah, boss fights in Sonic Rush, that is a pretty significant downer to me. That definitely hurts the experience a lot. This one boss is actually really cool, because it's one of the only bosses in the game where you don't have to wait to attack it. It's always vulnerable, and you can hit it as much as possible, and the design here is to take all of the opportunities to hit it to kill it quickly. This is a boss that, depending on how good you are, it can take several minutes to kill it, or you could kill it in like 50 seconds. And because of its design, you're always active and you're always doing stuff, and that makes it way better and much more in line with the rest of the game's gameplay. And another thing I will give it credit for is that it finally has the first ever good rival battle where you have a fight against another playable character. The Sonic and Blaze fight in this game is actually pretty sick. It's really fun, and it doesn't feel like a clusterfuck pile of nonsense like all the other rival fights have been. And then, of course, we have to talk about the special stages, which are actually my favorite in the entire series so far. I really like them in this game, actually. First of all, this team has finally decided, hey, let's stop making getting the Chaos Emeralds a fucking nightmare. This time around, accessing the special stages is super simple. All you have to do is find one of these pinwheel things in a level, and while you're holding onto it, just boost for a while, and then you'll get sent into a portal into the special stage. Super duper easy, and these things are all over the place. You don't really have to go that out of your way to hunt them down. You're just gonna find them pretty naturally by playing. And the system actually makes it so that if you screw up a special stage, then you don't have to replay the entire level. You can just grab back onto the pulley, and if you have boost meter, you can just do it again immediately, which is really nice. Also, you don't even have to complete the level once you get the Chaos Emerald. You can just exit the level and you still get it. So the process of getting the Chaos Emeralds has been smoothed out and streamlined so much, which is fantastic. And then as for the actual special stages themselves, they are the classic Sonic 2 half-pipe thing, which I think this makes it the 4th time they've used these things, but these are actually my favorite versions of them so far. For one, because they're actually in 3D, you can actually see what the fuck is coming up. There's no, like, blindsiding you when you're taking turns or anything like that. But also, the way you control them in this game is you use the touchscreen to control Sonic, rather than using left and right. And this is one of those rare instances where the touchscreen controls actually are to the game's benefit, because it gives you way greater precision in terms of where you want to position Sonic than you would have using traditional controls. In my case, I'm playing this on an emulator, so I'm using the mouse to control Sonic, and it works super well. It actually adds to the gameplay because now, rather than having like a default speed that you can steer left and right with, you can zip to the other side of the pipe super duper quickly, and this allows them to have much more challenging level design where they have a whole row of bombs that you have to precisely weave through while moving very quickly. It's pretty cool. You also have these things where you have to tap on different portions of the screen really quickly to get some extra bananas, and you know, that works pretty well. Though actually playing this with a mouse I thought was pretty difficult. I think with a touchscreen this would be much easier. But yeah, that's pretty much it. There's not really that much more to say. It's pretty much just exactly what you expect from the Sonic 2 special stages. It's just that this time they're actually fun. Look at what happens when you can actually see what's ahead of you. Unlike the stages in Sonic 2, where it was pretty much just memorization that made you good enough to get the Chaos Emeralds, here I feel like when I fail the special stage, it's because I made mistakes and messed up, and not because I didn't already know exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. So with those two together, the process of getting the Chaos Emeralds in this game was totally smooth, super easy, and really fun. I can't believe I'm saying it, but I actually quite like the Chaos Emerald quest in this Sonic game. They finally did it in such a way where I don't really have any problems here, and I do think this does add to the game in a positive way. I guess there was nothing really wrong with these being here this entire time, it's just that the execution was bad. And naturally, as always, we have the Supersonic final boss, and that is exactly the same as always, so that I have nothing to say about. I guess one thing is that this game does make you play it both as Sonic and Blaze to get access to this, but considering how fun and replayable the game is, I was just gonna do that anyway, so I don't really think that's a problem. So that's Sonic Rush. Honestly, I think this is a fantastic Sonic game, one of the best out there overall. The boss fights are the one sour thing here that I think do hamper the experience, but other than that, I think the gameplay is super fun, the level design is really good, the special stages are actually really enjoyable. Even over the classic games, this is one of the Sonic games that I have the least to complain about. That doesn't necessarily make it my favorite, I don't think it's as fun necessarily as other Sonic games, but just in terms of being a video game overall, the complete package, I think this game is awesome. Thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time.